been frustrated for 40 years. 40 years of the complaints being lodged, of judging the people, 40 years of eating manna from heaven, 40 years of wandering in circles, 40 years of murmuring and whining, 40 years on the very edge of the promise, but never entering. Moses is frustrated and he is annoyed. But we can't always make the same mistake that Moses does. For Moses makes the mistake that God is just as frustrated with the Israelites as he is. That if he's annoyed, that must mean God's annoyed. Because the people come and complain. This new generation rises up. Hey, Moses, where's the water? Are we going to just be out here to die like our fathers died? And Moses goes to God. God, they're complaining again. Deja vu, God. I feel like I'm living Groundhog Day here in the desert. Like, are you going to do something about it? And God says, oh, go speak to the rock. Water will come out. You can feed the people. You can help the people. We can provide for the people. And Moses walks away from a conversation with God, and he's like, I don't understand. I'm frustrated with them. I'm angry with them. I cannot stand them. And God's like, hey, go give them water? Like, God, aren't you just as mad with them as I am with them? Aren't you just as frustrated with them as I am frustrated with them? But what Moses doesn't completely understand is that although we can be frustrating, God is always faithful, and he will always give us what we need. He still is going to give them water. Even when Moses disobeys God and doesn't speak to the rock, but instead strikes it 2 times, water still flows. Like, you would think he would strike the rock and nothing would happen for dramatic effect, and then God would, like, smite him or something, right? No, he strikes the rock, he disobeys God, but the rock still produces a flow of water and satisfies the Israelites. Why? Because God's faithfulness has very little to do with ours. Very little to do with our obedience. God is who he is. He is faithful. He is gracious. The flow keeps on coming no matter how it turns out. But because God is faithful, we actually place ourselves in danger of thinking that because the rock is still flowing, that we are still under his blessing. And so Moses gets called by God, and God goes, Moses, you dishonored me. You misrepresented me. And now it will no longer be you and Aaron who will take my people into the promised land. If anything, Moses, not only after, but I would say before, is disappointed. He's disappointed. He's disappointed that they didn't go inherit the land immediately. He's disappointed that here's a whole brand new generation with the same old problems as their fathers. He's disappointed that God's gonna show grace where he doesn't think grace is deserved. He's disappointed with the people. He's disappointed with himself. And he's disappointed with God. If I would define frustration today, I would define it this way. Frustration is disappointment left unchecked. Frustration is disappointment left unchecked. Not only do we have a brand new generation, but these were the children who were born in the desert. They are now all grown up. They are all now adults. They are all now the leaders of their households. Moms and dads are passing away. It is a new generation of Israel in the middle of the wilderness, and they are complaining the same way that their parents complained. Disappointment, all grown up, is frustration. How much of your disappointments in this life, how much of the things that didn't work out the way that you thought that they would work out, have you left so unchecked and unsettled and unaddressed that they have actually fermented into frustration? If you see an angry person, if you see someone who lashes out and has an outburst, if you see someone with a grudge or with bitterness, I'd venture to say that pain is not far from view. Moses is in pain. It's so interesting to me that an entire new generation in the wilderness, kids all grown up, have the same issues as mom and dad. Why are these kids so nasty? Because mom and dad were so nasty. Why are they so discontent? Because their whole lives they grew up watching mom and dad show God discontentment. Why do they complain and murmur? Because mom and dad complained and murmured. They didn't learn from the mistakes of their parents, and now they are bound to repeat them. Listen closely. It is not a problem to complain to God. The problem is that Israel is complaining about God. Take your complaints to God. God, this is my issue. God, this is my problem. God, this marriage, and God, these kids, and God, the job, and the kids at home now, and God, this didn't work out, and God, I don't know how I'm going to pull this off. God will listen to your complaints. He hears our moaning, but he doesn't hear our murmurs. Because moaning is going, God, I need. God, I can't. God, you must. And a murmur is, God, you are. God, you aren't. I can complain to God all day long. He will hear me. He will send comfort to me. But when I start complaining about God, I allow immature theology to control the way I see others, myself, and God. These kids should have watched what their parents did. And here they are, a new generation with the same old problem. The same old problem. Anybody feel like 2020 is just Groundhog Day? My son, we wake up in the morning, hey, Dad, good morning. I told him he can't come out of his room until the sun's up. So his first words to us every day are, hey, the sun's up. I'm like, good morning. He goes, Dad, the sun's up. What are we going to do today? And usually I'm still half asleep, and I say the same thing we do every day, Pinky. Like, we're staying home in quarantine. Hoping that something breaks, that something changes, just completely going over our internet data rates as often as we can. Like, this is where we're at, son. It's the same old day. We started playing a board game, Sorry. And every time it's the same situation. Sorry, Dad. I'm like, this is every day. This is like, I'm reliving the same day. I'm reliving the same week. Every Thursday is the governor's announcement. Every time I look on my phone, it's another political advertisement. Every time I look in the streets, there's another protest. And it's just like, this is just Groundhog Day, living over and over and over again. Yesterday, we saw people march on Washington, and almost 50 years ago, they did the exact same thing. Us human beings are prone. We are prone to repeating the mistakes of the generation behind us because we will not face the issues and the fears and the concerns that are in front of us. Because we can look at the promise of peace and pasture and comfort and milk and honey and still turn around and wander the desert like mom and dad did. Because we don't like change. Change is uncomfortable for us. Change is challenging. And so the Israelites make the mistake. Not only are they disappointed, but their leader, he is disappointed. I believe that Moses' disappointment stems from three things in his life. I believe that if you and I can learn from these three things, that we can actually win our fight with frustration. We can actually win the battle in our own minds with being disappointed. And we could actually nip in the bud something that when full grown will ruin our futures. The first thing I believe that Moses did was that he made the mistake. He made the mistake of assuming that his calling was also his healing. He made the mistake of assuming that his calling was also his healing. When was Moses called? Why was Moses called? Remember where we find him? He's out there shepherding a flock. He's with his staff in the desert in Moab. He has left the area in Egypt where he was raised as a prince, as an Egyptian, knowing that he was of Hebrew blood. The reason he is in the desert in the first place is that he is running from something. The Bible tells us that Moses, with so much anger and frustration, watched as an Egyptian beat a Hebrew, stepped in, killed the man, and buried him, and then ran for his life. Moses has a problem with anger. He's got a frustrating problem with anger. Then God calls him, Moses, I'm calling you. What does God do? He sends him back to the very place he was running from. Yeah, you're going to go back to Egypt. No wonder Moses is like, hey, God, you got the wrong guy. I'm a wanted fugitive. I'm a criminal on the run here. I'm an outlaw. You got the wrong guy. You want me to go to the very place that I've ran from. I've been running from my fear of Egypt. I've been running from my frustration with the people that I grew up with. And God, now you want me to go back there. And God's like, yeah, I want you to run to your fear so that you can free my people. And God commissions him and calls him. And then he goes, and we know about the 10 plagues, and we know about all the miracles, we know about the blood in the Nile. We see it all, this amazingness take place. What a wonderful story. And then God delivers them out of Egypt, sends them into the wild, takes Moses to the top of a mountain, and gives him the law, the 10 commandments. What does Moses do? He comes down from the mountain. He was in the Shekinah glory of God. He literally is glowing in the dark. This is a radioactive moment in the Bible. And as he descends from the mountain, he finds the Israelites have made an idol and are worshiping it. And what does he do? He takes the tablets that God has commissioned him with, and he breaks them. Once again, his anger and his frustration have gotten the best of him. And now here, 40 years later in the desert, 40 years after wandering, 40 years after settling in where he was supposed to pass through, and there is Moses once again. God, these people you gave me, I can't stand them. I don't know what we're going to do here. Let's just kill them all, God. And God's like, no, speak to the rock. You say the words, Moses, and water will come flowing, for I am good, and I am gracious, and I am faithful, and I am consistent even when they are inconsistent. You speak to the rock. And one more time in his life, Moses' anger and his frustration and his fear of his past and his own insecurities get the best of him once again, and he strikes the rock not once, but twice. He was called by God, but he left his frustration unchecked. It is possible, Jesus follower, for you and I today to be anointed by the Most High, to be gifted by the Spirit of God, to be saved from sin and hell, and still struggle, and still fall short of God's glory. Just because he's called me doesn't mean he's done with me. I'm a work in progress. You're a work in progress. But so many of us, we get the title slapped on us and we just immediately assume I'm healed and I am whole. No, justification makes me pure before God. But the process of Jesus following is called sanctification. It is the ongoing purification. As I follow Jesus, he makes me more and more like him. Moses left his frustration unchecked. In the very beginning of his story, murder, anger, frustration, inadequacy is the same thing we see at the end of his story. Ironically, his name actually means drawn out. For he was drawn out of the Nile River as a baby. Our whole life is a drawing out. where God calls us and he draws us out of the wild to the burning bush, where he calls us out of Egypt to the wilderness, where he calls us out of the wilderness into the promise. This calling out, this drawing out is what Moses' namesake was, but he never allowed God to dig out in his own vulnerability, his frustration, his anger. I don't want to make excuses for his anger, but granted, he was abandoned as a child. Imagine growing up knowing your mom gave you up. I mean, I can understand his anger. I can understand his frustration. Growing up in a palace, and he's the only one who looks like him. I can understand it, but we cannot excuse it. Some of you, the things you have gone through, let's just narrow it down to this year. You can go through 2020, but you cannot go through 2020 and not be affected by it. We're not going to get through this and it not change us, shape us, scar us even. You've gone through some pain in your life. You keep brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal, but I would venture to say that some of the things you and I have gone through in our life have led to some disappointments and ultimately some frustrations. You don't get to go through what Moses went through. He took a man's life. He was abandoned by his mom. He was exiled from his own family that raised him. He had a yearning for people that for the last 40 years of his life have done nothing but make him anxious. I get it. When anger is present, so is pain. So is pain. Have you been hurt? Have you been wronged? Have you been used or abused? Have you been neglected? Have you been maligned, marginalized, oppressed? Have you been overlooked? Are you frustrated? Are you frustrated with the very people God gave you to take care of? Are you frustrated about the future? Are you afraid of your past? You are called, his chosen generation, a royal priesthood, his very own children. But there's still work to do in healing. There's still work to do in your heart. And God wants to do that work. Don't make the mistake that Moses did. Don't leave unresolved issues inside of you, for eventually they will boil up in frustration. The second thing Moses did was that he got triggered. Isn't that like, that's a ring word in 2020 still, right? Triggered. Like he has these triggers. And it's usually to do with the people that he's doing a really good job of taking care of and being super gracious and super nice to. But every single time that something goes wrong, they fight back. They complain. They rise up. They want to go back to Egypt. And in some small ways, isn't that kind of like leadership even in 2020? Like people will follow you while the Red Sea is parting, and they'll follow you while the plagues are taking place in Egypt, and they'll follow you when everything is good, but the second things aren't going like the way they expected, all of a sudden everybody revolts. Like we'll follow you until things go bad, and then I don't want to follow you anymore. This is Moses. No wonder he's frustrated. It makes total sense. But he keeps having these moments. He's got these moments. My son the other day, he had a fit. He couldn't even catch his breath. He was hyperventilating. I don't even remember what the problem was, but he had this issue, and I went to him and I said, "Son, what's the matter?" And he's on the couch and he just can't even compose himself, and he goes, "Dad, I'm just having a moment." I'm like, "You're 4. You shouldn't have moments." I'm just having a moment. That's Moses. Except for Moses, he had a lot of moments. He had 40 years of moments. Frustrated with himself, frustrated with God's people, and ultimately frustrated with God. The second mistake he made was that he lashes out at the very people God called him to lead out. God says, "Talk to the rock, Moses. We'll send water. We'll take care of the people." Moses leaves the very presence of God like the servant whose debt was forgiven. He leaves the very presence of God. And he goes and he shakes down someone who owes him a few bucks. And he says, you wicked and rebellious people, you want water? Here. And he strikes the rock. And he's lashing out at the people God's called him to love, to lead. He's got his priorities all mixed up. He's left his frustration so unchecked. And he's having that, yet again, Moses, another moment. Granted, he is invested. Nobody gets frustrated at people that they're not invested in. Like, that's why you get so frustrated with the kids, right? You're like, dude, I give you everything. I give you a roof over your head. I give you this, and I give you that, and I make sure you're fed, and I make sure you're clothed, and I make sure you're happy, and we got you into that school, and here you are. Now I'm frustrated with you because I'm invested in you. I think about the first car you bought. You made the investment into the car. When that thing got scratched, that was a problem. But the beater you inherited, you never worried about that thing. Like, it is what it is. Why? I didn't invest in it. Here's Moses. He has invested the last 40 years of his life into Israel. He's invested because he believes in their future. He believes that something could come of this. He believes in the promise of God. If you're frustrated today, don't be too hard on yourself. It might be a sign that you're invested. It might be a sign that the blood, sweat, and tears matter enough for you to have this moment. But frustration left unchecked turns into what it did for Moses. Failure. Someone once told me, Ray, failure isn't final until you quit. That when you quit too early, that's just failure in disguise. But when you stick it out and you are invested and it fails, at least you proved yourself to be faithful. And here's Moses. If we can give him any props today, he didn't quit. He just got frustrated. And he lashed out at the people he was supposed to lead. I think some of his problem was that Moses didn't know how to draw boundaries in his life. Remember we talked about Jethro visiting him, his father-in-law? And from morning until evening, the people came with their issues before him. And he judged the people, and they all loved him for it. He gave them all of his time, and his father-in-law goes, you've been gone all day, morning to night. That's not good. He's like, but I'm judging the people, and it's great, and they love me, and they love us, and I'm just trying to be a good leader. Why do you think that the Israelites consistently complained to Moses? I believe it's because Moses was a people pleaser. I believe that he wanted to make everybody happy, and he didn't want to hurt everybody's feelings or leave anybody out. And so he always arranged things in a way where he was showing them the love and the affection. And God, they're complaining about food. God, can you send manna? And here's some rules about manna. Okay, we need water. Okay, we need a miracle. Okay, we need guidance. How about a cloud by day and fire by night? And we need, and they're always coming to him. If it is consistent in your life that people are continually lodging complaints to you, there's a good chance that you don't have the boundaries set up around you that they wouldn't even be able to overcome and bring them in the first place. This is Moses' own fault. He has no boundaries. There are no relational limitations. Anybody at any time for anything could lodge a complaint against the leader of a nation. And so he's frustrated. He's frustrated at the murmurings once again. I think he may have given the microphone to the murmuring people one too many times. I think maybe this might just be the fault of Moses, for they rise up again to complain on a platform he built for them. Here, whatever you guys need, just let me know. I'm here for you. Losing sight of what he was supposed to do. Lead them. Here's the third thing he's done, and I believe we are still doing it today. He struck when he should have spoken. He struck when he should have spoken. Here is his instructions from God in the tent of the tabernacle to Moses. Moses, I want you to go, and I want you to go to the rock, and I want you to speak to it, and tell the rock to produce water, and then water will flow and feed and give everyone something to drink. Can you do that? I want you to talk. I want you to speak to the rock and just tell it what to do. And Moses turns around and he strikes it. I want you to tell the rock, and then he strikes the rock. I want you to speak to the rock, and instead he smites the rock. God gives him specific instructions. Specific instructions. And for me, I was always so confused. Like, okay, so he hit the rock instead of spoke to the rock. Now he's banned from the promised land. God's so mean. Like, that's so unfair, and that's just not cool. But Moses has a pattern of striking things. He walks into Egypt. And he strikes the Nile River. What happens? Remember? The water becomes blood. And he walks to the Red Sea, and he takes the staff that he had when God found him in the desert at the burning bush, and he takes the same staff that he's always used. And he takes the staff, and he strikes the water, and the Red Sea parts. And he takes the staff at the beginning of the journey in the wilderness, and he strikes the rock. And water flows. Moses is so attuned and conditioned to the use of his staff and the striking that he is willing to disobey God's new command, assuming he'll just work in the same old way. God, when we were at the Nile, you let me hit the water, and then the whole thing kind of went down. And God, when we went to the Red Sea, and everyone was afraid, and then Egypt was coming behind us with their chariots, like you let me hit the water, and then everyone got to walk through. And then when we got across, and we didn't have any more water in the desert, you let me strike the rock the first time, and you let me get used, and everyone got to see what I did. And now, I don't get to have my moment. Now you just want me to speak to the rock? Like, what does the staff represent anymore if it's not the miraculous? What does the staff that I've been carrying as my crutch for the last 40 years even matter if I cannot use it? Have I gotten so used to the way that things have been that I can't see the way things could be? And then he strikes the rock twice. Because he wanted everyone to know that it was him. You want water? I did it for your parents. I'll do it for you. Hits the rock. Water comes because God is good, and because God is faithful, and because God is caring, and because God is gracious. But consequences were immediate. It has been said that anger is a sin with its own consequences attached. That the moment you are angry, the moment you have an outburst, the moment you lose your temper, the moment you have a moment, the consequences are attached. When's the last time you had an outburst of anger where you just lashed out at someone, when you had the temper tantrum, when you rolled down the window and you put out the finger? When is the last time you did that and didn't immediately feel stupid? Didn't immediately feel ashamed? Didn't immediately regret what you just did? Anger is that way. It comes with its own attached consequence, immediate punishment, shame, guilt, embarrassment. Eating our own words. I think the big deal about him striking and not speaking is that it goes to show that Moses has not fully believed God. Isn't that what he says? Because you did not believe in me. Because you did not believe in me, you will not lead them. What is he talking about? Moses led him through the desert. He did his whole thing. And then it hit me. When God first met Moses and the bush was burning but not burning, he said, I'm going to use you to deliver my people from Egypt. I have heard their cries. I'm going to send you. And what did Moses say in response to the call of God on his life? What did he say? But God, I'm not good at speaking. I stutter. And he said, I will be with you. I will be with you. And here we are, decades and decades later, and God tells him to do what he originally said. Hey, Moses, go speak. And stammering, stuttering Moses decides that he cannot do that. And so once again, he strikes. Do you know it? Have you not heard? Has it not hit you? Your inadequacy, your struggle with self-worth, your own self-image, self-loathing, self-hatred is keeping you from the promise of God. He said, Moses, go to Pharaoh and go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And he said, God, I can't speak. I'm not good at speaking. I stutter. And even after God delivered him from the hand of Pharaoh and across the Red Sea and across the desert, even after he made water flow from the rock that followed them everywhere throughout the desert. And he says, I just want you to speak. Moses, you just need a word. You just say the word and water will come. Instead of speaking to the rock, he speaks to the people and he strikes the rock. Can I ask you a question? Do you know what the rock represented? Do you know why Moses is banned from the promised land? Do you know the significance of this situation? 1 Corinthians chapter 1 or chapter 10, Paul starts it off. Verse 1, he says this, remember our history. This is Paul. He's a theologian. He is a Jewish scholar. His history and understanding of ancient Jewish ways goes beyond anybody that I have ever seen in my entire life as I have studied this book and dedicated my life. He is the guy who gets God in the Old Testament, and he writes this, remember our history. And be warned, all our ancestors, they were led by a providential cloud and taken miraculously through the sea. They went through the waters in a baptism like ours as Moses led them from enslaving death to salvation life. They all ate and drank identical food and drank meals provided daily by God. Listen closely, friends. They drank from the rock, God's fountain for them that stayed with them. My translation to home says, accompanied them wherever they were. And the rock, Paul says, was Christ. If you want to see Jesus in the Old Testament, you looked at that rock. Scholars have this idea, we call it types of Christ. Things, objects, moments, or people before Christ that foreshadowed Jesus, foreshadowed what he would do for mankind, and typify who he was. We think about Joseph, who was stricken, who was put into a pit, who was brought out of a pit, placed in a palace, and brought about deliverance for his family. He was a type of Christ, that his story aligned with how Jesus would one day do that for the whole world. this rock, as he struck it in the beginning of their wilderness story, poured out water. That the rock was stricken, and from the striking poured out provision. And then that same rock, this is crazy, I don't know how to explain this, followed them around the desert for 40 years. I mean, was it rolling? I don't know. Did it just like magically appear every time they showed up? I have no clue, no idea. But the Bible is telling me, and Paul is telling us right now, that wherever they went, the rock went, providing water. And they complain once again, what about the water? What about the water? And Moses strikes the rock that had already been stricken, therefore demolishing the image of Jesus in the Old Testament. He destroys the topography here. Jesus was the rock, and the rock was Jesus, and he's pouring out, and he was stricken, and he was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. And here you are, Moses, this is the perfect image of what is to come for my people, and you're smacking the rock again. He was stricken once, he was stricken for all. All you got to do now is speak to him. Moses is banned from the promise, not because he just got angry. He misrepresented Jesus to the world. How many churches, how many so-called Jesus followers, how many American Christians are out there right now striking the rock, condemning the very people God called us to set free, striking the rock, belittling the sacrifice of Jesus on a cross, telling people to pay penance, telling people to work themselves out of their sins and their issues. We don't need to strike the rock, we need to speak to the rock. We don't need to strike, we need a word. We just need a word, and the word, the Bible tells us, became flesh, and he dwelt among us. He shattered the imagery of Jesus in the Old Testament for this 40-year desert dwelling of Israel. The rock was already struck. The only thing required of Moses was a word. And the same can be said of you today. In your fight with frustration, you don't need to strike the rock. Jesus has already paid the penalty for our sin. His blood poured out on a cross. His body was broken on our behalf. And from the cross flows out the water we need, the spirit we needed, the cleansing we needed, the nourishment we needed. You don't need to pay for your sins, friend. Jesus already did that. Are you speaking to the people when you should be speaking to the rock? That's Moses. God, what do you want me to do? Go talk to the rock and water will come out. Okay, cool. He talks to the people and he strikes the rock. Are you talking to people when you should be talking to the rock? Are you complaining to the people around you, your spouse and your friends? Are you complaining to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all the people who you think are listening to you? Are you complaining out there instead of complaining to God? They can't do anything for you. He can do everything for you. Are you striking the rock? Waking up every day feeling condemned, waking up every day feeling like you're mad at God, waking up every day